My name is Ajit Gopalakrishnan. I'm the Chief Performance Officer for the Department of Education. I'm glad to be joined by my colleague, Renee Savoy. And thank you, Renee, for organizing this presentation and for putting it all together. And we've been talking about this session for some time. And we're putting it together because there are many ways of understanding student growth in our system. And over the years, from when we first started implementing Smarter Balanced in 2014 as a field test, and then in 2015 as operational, we've all wanted to move to looking at student growth. And so over the years in public EdSight and also in EdSight Secure, we have presented and incorporated different ways of looking at that growth information. Some of it we developed from our end based on what we wanted to put out, but frankly, others that came up as a result of district requests and feedback. So the purpose of this session really is to just review what are the different ways in which we can understand student growth and what are the strengths and limitations of each approach. I don't have any activities planned for this short session. So if you have questions, I believe the chat is open. So please feel free to put in any questions that you might have as I go through these slides and talk you through some of these points. But please feel free to put in your questions and comments in the chat. That would be most appreciated. I believe we have about an hour. I'm not sure I'll need the whole time, but we'll see how it goes, and we'll remain flexible. All right. So what do we mean by growth, and how is it different from status? This should not be new for anybody on the call, but just to level set and get us all on the same page. When we use the term achievement, proficiency, or a status measure, we're talking about a one-time snapshot measurement of a student's performance. So in any given year, how did the student do, or how did a group of students do? That's a snapshot, point in time measurement. That's a status measure. When we talk about growth, we're talking about that change in that status from one point to the next. That's what, when we say growth or change, that's what we mean. So what are the two sort of primary ways in which we can think about student growth and change in that status? And the two sort of primary approaches are, you can group them into cross-sectional approaches or longitudinal approaches. And the cross-sectional approaches are really comparing different snapshots in time. And we'll look at examples of that and what are the limitations and strengths or possibilities in that approach. The sort of preferred approach that, when I started off by saying with the switch to Smarter Balanced, folks wanted sort of more of a growth measure, is to look longitudinally over time how groups of students are doing. Not necessarily different groups of students over time, but similar or the same students over time. So that's when we start to look at longitudinal information. And there are a couple of ways we have sort of mentioned that, spoken about that longitudinal. We've talked about rough cohort and match cohort, and we'll sort of review that and how there are different ways in which we're sort of understanding that growth information and presenting that growth information. So let's first start with cross-sectional data and looking at trend in cross-sectional data. And I'm going to spend a few minutes on this slide. So I mentioned that cross-sectional data is really achievement at a point in time, or data at a point in time. And what I'm presenting here is a table, the first table on the top there, which shows the measure that we commonly speak about, and that what districts commonly tend to use is looking at the percent level 3 or 4 on Smarter Balanced. And you can look at it for SAT as well, but in this case, I'm focusing on Smarter Balanced because we're looking at growth as well. But typically, folks will look at this percent level 3 or 4, sometimes referred to as the proficiency rate. And in that case, they look at this cross-sectional information and they'll look at grade 4, in this case I've highlighted, and sort of looking at that information horizontally over time and to say, how has grade 4 achievement changed over time? And obviously, one of the biggest threats to making inference about improvement here, when looking at change from one year to the next, is each year it's pretty much a different group of students. Unless there are a small percentage of students might be repeating a grade, for the most part, the kids are different. So saying how grade 4 did or improved or declined based on that type of information is really problematic, because it makes no reference or no recognition of the baseline for that student group that was there in a particular year. So, for example, when looking at the 2022 performance, when you see 48.2, yes, it's higher from 2021. But how does it look? Because those students were in grade 3 in the prior year. How did their performance change over time would be the longitudinal perspective. But when you look cross-sectionally, you don't sort of appreciate or recognize that baseline. So two threats to sort of inferences about improvement. One is the fact that the students are different. And given that the students are different, there's no recognition of what baseline those students bring to that snapshot measurement in a particular year. And if we just look at this sort of snapshot measurement, and especially when focusing on the proficiency rate, and I'm going to spend some time on the proficiency rate in particular, is that it leads to some unhealthy practices. And we've seen this with NCLB in the old days. And I hear, sadly, even today, about some cases where this might still be happening in terms of focusing on those bubble students, those students who are just below level 3. Let's just get those students over the hump, and then our percent level 3 will look better. And I've included chronic absenteeism as an example of a measure that is a rate. Anytime you have a rate that's a binary measure, there's usually a threshold. So in the case of chronic absenteeism, for example, there is that attendance rate of 90%. And students who are above 90% are considered okay. Students who are below 90%, at or below 90%, are considered chronically absent. Of course, below 90%, there is a big spectrum. There could be students who are at 70% attendance, 80% attendance, but chronic absence only looks at that one sort of line in the sand. Any improvement above or below that cut point is really ignored when you just look at a particular rate. So when looking at cross-sectional data, especially with sort of this proficiency rate, you run into some issues with that. So I already started getting into this issue of scale scores versus proficiency rate. So let's take a closer look at that. And this actually comes from a publication from Smarter Balanced, from their technical advisory committee, where they caution against characterizing student achievement strictly in terms of those achievement levels. And if you look at some of the language on the left, if you define these levels of achievement, if you speak of student achievement purely in terms of those achievement levels, it's really an oversimplification. And the scale score is really the most precise measure of a student's achievement. And the scale score is recommended for looking at gaps or change over time. And which is why when we compute our performance index, which is our achievement index, we use the scale score, or definitely for our growth model, we use our scale scores as well. It's interesting when we, just to sort of speak a little bit about the SAT, people are very familiar with the SAT scale and the 200 to 800 scale. People are very familiar, and they're familiar because they understand what the numbers mean. And so people know what score on an SAT might get you into what college. And so there's a frame of reference, a point of reference. So when we talked to the College Board in those early days when we adopted the SAT about setting achievement levels and setting standards, that was not really an interest of the College Board. That was more an interest for us because of our federal requirements for reporting based on the proficiency rates and these achievement levels. So I just want you to understand that, when there is a frame of reference for that scale, we really don't need to think of student performance in terms of these achievement levels, but because that's how we've historically been used to sort of reporting this information, that artifact still continues. But from a measurement perspective, that scale is the most precise measure. And why do we even say that? You know, there's really not that much difference for a student who is just above that proficiency cut and a student who's just below that proficiency cut. If you were to look at the standard error of measurement of those student scores who are just above or just below, frankly, there might not be any difference between those two students in terms of their achievement. But one student might be classified as proficient and another one might be classified as not proficient. So it's important to really understand what measure we're using to think about achievement trend and growth as well. So I offer that caution as well. Let's look at another example here. And this is a real Connecticut district. And what I have here is the Smarter Balanced scale. And what's plotted on there is the average achievement for each grade. And that's plotted by that sort of the pinkish circle that's in each grade. And you can see that in this case, the average performance of the students in each of the grades, in some cases is at the cut, some cases it's slightly above the cut, in some cases it's slightly below the cut. And you can see on the top, I have put the proficiency rates in blue. And I want you to take a moment to look at the difference in the proficiency rates across these grades, where you see, you know, in the case of grade 3, where the average performance is right at that cut point, it's about 49%. And in the case of grade 5, where the average performance is a little above that cut, it's 59%. And sometimes when presenting these types of results, if you just use the proficiency rate, there is a tendency to think that you know, these students in grade 5 are performing tremendously higher. Oh, 10 percentage point difference. But when you look at the average performance, maybe it's not as pronounced as the proficiency rate might lead us to believe. So I think it's important to sort of juxtapose those two measures and sort of keep that in mind. And also note that the proficiency rate is a fraction, right? You're dividing the numerator is those who are proficient and the denominator is the total students. So if you have a small group of students, 50 students, 60 students in a grade, you know, one kid is more than 1%. So a few kids this way, that way can tremendously change that percentage. So again, these are cautions to think about as we think about growth with these measures. So using scale scores for looking at trend, using the index, using the growth model, definitely a much more robust way to look at that. Now let's compare sort of this cross-sectional to longitudinal data. And I started to get into this when I initially talked about proficiency rates when I gave that initial example, but let's take another sort of closer look at a particular example. Again, this is from a real Connecticut district where they had, you know, from their Smarter Balanced report and looking at proficiency rates. So in this example, I'm looking at grade 8 just for point of illustration. And what I'm trying to show here is that if you look cross-sectionally, in other words, horizontally at grade 8 scores for year 1 and year 2, the inference would be that grade 8 performance declined. And that's not an incorrect inference. That's fine. But I would be hard pressed to say that the performance in grade 8 declined because of what happened in grade 8 during that year. So sort of that the instructional intervention led to that decline. That would be a very strong or an unsupported inference to make here, especially if you look longitudinally, where you look at the grade 7 scores. Again, this is a rough cohort example. We're not matching the students, but if you look at the proficiency rate for the 8th graders in year 2 compared to the proficiency rate for 7th graders in year 1, you see that actually there's been an increase in the proficiency rate, and the longitudinal view shows that the increase was actually 3.4%, whereas the cross-sectional shows that the achievement declined. So looking longitudinally gives you very different information than looking cross-sectionally, horizontally. And the moment you start to look longitudinally, we're shifting now from looking cross-sectionally to looking longitudinally. The moment you start to look at things longitudinally, there are some other threats to inferences that creep in, and we have to be really mindful of those threats. So when you look at rough cohort in particular, here, this is rough cohort information because we're not matching the students from year 1 to year 2. When you look at rough cohort information, it's important that the scales support that type of measurement. And I will share a couple of examples or a couple of pieces of information that will sort of back up that claim that we can use the Smarter Balance scale to measure that. But when you look at rough cohort, the other thing to keep in mind is that the groups of students are not exactly matched. So if you have high mobility, the kids in year 1 and the kids in year 2 could be different from 7th grade to 8th grade. So mobility could be a factor here. So that's something to keep in mind here as well. The other caution I would throw is, I've already talked about sort of the challenges with looking solely at proficiency rate. The way and I'll flip back to the slide for a second, the way these cuts are established on any sort of scale like this is through a process called standard setting. And that's a human subjective sort of decision-making process. It's a scientific process, but it's also a human judgmental process. So when you look at setting standards across grades, there are some vagaries that might come in to those achievement cut levels across those grades. So it's important to sort of know that too. Again, this is sort of exposing to you that while the assessments are rigorous, vetted, high quality assessments, there are some human elements to these assessment development processes, and there are some judgments that educators have to make to establish those cut points on those scales. So it's really important to understand that as we're interpreting these sort of trend information. So hence this point about vagaries of standard setting across the grades, important to keep that in mind as well. So how do we know that the Smarter Balance scale can support inferences across grades for growth? So this is not an exhaustive presentation on that topic by any means. This is really just designed to give you some very high level information. If you're interested in more, we're happy to send you technical information on this. Two things to keep in mind. One is that the items on the Smarter Balanced assessment, and this actually goes 3 through 11, but since Connecticut is using 3 through 8, I've illustrated that here. The 3 through 8 items, the items on the Smarter Balanced assessment are actually plotted on the same difficulty scale. And what this is showing you is that the first section for both ELA and math shows you all the items, but then it shows you by grade. And you see there's a lot of overlap in terms of item difficulty across the grades. There is a sort of steady upward ladder perspective here, right, where you see in each grade sort of the items becoming increasingly difficult as you get across grade. But what you'll also see that there are easy items in every grade. There are also hard items in every grade. And that ultimately plot back onto the same achievement scale. So that's kind of one thing that I want you to keep in mind. The second thing is that Smarter Balance has gone through several peer reviews, one at the federal level, through external peer reviews, and after all that, deemed to meet requirements under the federal law. And it is not just one thing, those requirements sort of span validity, reliability, test administration practices, test security, reporting, etc. And then we also have our own technical advisory committee that's done work on this and has reviewed these assessments very closely and gives us confidence that we can do what we're doing in terms of measuring growth across the grades with the Smarter Balanced scale. So now that we've established that We want to look at the scale. We don't want to just look at proficiency rates because that has its limitations. And we've established that the scale can be used for that purpose. Let's now look at some examples. And we'll start with the variety of reports that EdSight offers. And we'll start with the rough cohort report scenarios to begin with. And I'm going to give you some examples. And again, I don't see any questions in the chat. This probably isn't new to most of you. You probably know this information. But if you have any questions or comments, please do jump in. I also realized that we just released the accountability results yesterday, and you're all probably deep in that. We had scheduled this session well in advance of when we knew exactly the timing for that. So, so pardon that sort of time situation as well. I know you're all dealing with sort of looking through those reports and whatever and asking us questions. So thank you for your indulgence in this session at this time as well. So let's look at examples of rough cohort reports. So in EdSight, both on the public side and on the secure side, we have these rough cohort reports. And what do the rough cohort reports do? They plot that diagonal achievement across grades for groups of students, but over time. So let's look closely here. So I've given two charts, one on the left, one on the right. One on the left pertains to high need students. One on the right pertains to non-high need students. You will notice that I'm looking at the class of 2030 in both these cases, right? So the class of 2030, and we're looking at the achievement of the class of 2030 for high need students and non-high need students across time. So when the class of 2030 was in third grade, how did that group do? When the class of 2030 in fourth grade, how did they do? The class of 2030 in fifth grade, how did they do? In each case, we're sort of plotting that trend. Now, each dot point is not a matched set of students, could be slightly different students with mobility, but should predominantly be the same students, maybe 80, 90%, maybe more, depending on the district or school. But it gives you sort of a picture of how is the class of 2030 doing over time. In this case, high need students. In this, and the right-hand side, non-high need students. And you could see that, in the case of high need students, the achievement may have been a little stronger in grade 4. I'm making that inference by looking at the fact that the average achievement sort of made its way into level 2, but in grade 5 sort of went a little bit into level 1. Whereas the non-high need students consistently, solidly in level 3. And I know Eric has a question. I will get to that, Eric, in a moment, and I will answer it. So please do hang on. I appreciate that. So this is one way to look at the rough cohort report, and you can access this report in the achievement report or on the public EdSight public. If you go to Smarter Balanced, you'll get this report as well. In EdSight Secure, you can go into the achievement report, and I believe it's in that report as well. So let's look at another way in which we can use the rough cohort report. So this is another example, and in this case, we are comparing two different graduating classes. And the two different graduating classes, we're looking at the class of 2023 and the class of 2027. So the class of 2023 has already graduated. They graduated last year, and they're, doing whatever they're doing. Class of 2027, these students are currently right now in 9th grade. So they took the Smarter Balanced 8th grade last year. So in this case, if you look at the orange line, you'll see the average achievement for that last year's, for the class of 27, when they were in 8th grade, their average achievement is right there. And if you look at the class of 2023, their average achievement in grade 8, which would have been in the spring of 2019, is a little bit lower, but pretty close. But if you look at from 7th to 8th grade, what you see here is that, I mean, clearly the class of 2027 was impacted by the pandemic. And you can see that for the class of 2027, there is no dot point in grade 5. That was the year when we did not test in 1920. But we did test in 2021, and so that's their average performance. Here's their performance in 2022, and here's their performance in 2023. So notice how the slope for achievement from grade 7 to grade 8 for the class of 2027 is steeper than that for the class of 2023 from grade 7 to grade 8. So what this is illustrating for you is the rough cohort is showing that there is some recovery in the achievement for the class of 2027 before they entered high school from 7th to 8th grade. There was some recovery even in grade 7 because the slope is steeper. And in grade 8, the recovery is even steeper because of the slope. And ironically, well, not ironically, maybe correspondingly, if you look at the average percent of target achieved using our growth model, you will notice that for the class of 2027, which took the test in 8th grade in 2023, the APTA was 70.3, whereas from 7th to 8th grade 4 years ago, that APTA was 52.9. And you could see that visually here based on the slope of that achievement from 7th to 8th grade. So I'm just trying to tie in here how the rough cohort relates to our growth model as well. And you can look at the table on the right-hand side, because this is also illustrating how the pre-pandemic cohort, which is the class of 2023, did relative to the post-pandemic cohort, the class of 2027. And you can look at the class of 2023, which is the pre-pandemic cohort. You can look at from 17-18 to 18-19, how their achievement changed. Their average scale score for those 2 years really just changed by 10 points from 25-22 to 25-32. And their proficiency rate really didn't change. Whereas the average achievement for the post-pandemic cohort, the class of 2027, really grew significantly, which is also illustrated in this higher growth measure. I'll pause there. There's a lot going on in this slide. Are there any questions so far? And you know what? You can also raise your hand and we can unmute you if you want to orally ask your question as well. Go ahead, Danielle. You should be Daniel. You should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, G. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
Good. It's a question for you. As far as using performance index for gaps in schools, is there any talk about switching that metric to maybe using PTA? So, for example, a small school with high levels of special ed, high levels of ELL, your performance index is going to be lower because they're already starting with a low scale score, but they show a lot of growth, but their scale score doesn't improve tremendously because of where they started. So is there any talk about maybe switching that as schools identified with gaps because of that reason?
Interesting question. I know this is fresh on your minds because accountability reports just went out.
Yes, sir.
And Daniel, what district are you from, if you don't mind?
Hartford. East Hartford.
Yeah, so if because that gap is really speaking to the achievement gap, we still look at the actual achievement between the two groups. So in that case, it would be the high needs and the non-high needs students. So that's what we would use, and that is probably what's appropriate to use. I would say that if you do have, if your non-high needs group exceeds the state target of 75, so if you have a super high non-high needs group that's achievement is over 75, for the gap calculation purpose, we do cap the non-high needs at 75, so that you're not penalized, so to speak, in terms of your gap size for a extremely high non-high needs group. So at this point, there is not talk of change to using growth gaps as the means of identifying that flag, because it is trying to, it is trying to sort of look at where are the, after all the growth, where is the, how large is the gap in achievement?
Thank you, Ajit. But you understand kind of where I'm coming from? Like,
is that because there was a school not identified as a potential school of distinction, maybe?
Maybe.
Okay.
I just know that, we have a large, proportionally, we have a large special ed population at my school, and those kids have specific, learning disabilities, and so their scale score is very low, what I mean?
Yeah.
So obviously it drags down quite a bit. So but they can show growth. It's just not, you know what I mean? So
I do,
yeah.
and the gap still remains high.
Yeah.
Understood.
No. Thank you, G.
No problem. Thank you.
Just keep thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no problem. And I'll maybe take Eric's question too, because we're going a little bit here, a little bit related questions here. So Eric's question in the chat, for those who don't see it, is we're doing a lot of work calibrating our instructional priorities based on the frequency of items on the Smarter Balanced ICA, which was released almost 10 years ago. Is that assessment still representative of what the test likely contains today? Is the blueprint consistent, and is the SBA truly a form test? I think, Eric, by form test, you mean a fixed form test. And I believe the answer to that question is yes. The ICA is a fixed form test. I am not sure if the ICA has been updated over the years. We do not recommend really the use of the ICA to guide instructional priorities, because it really is just another long test. We do recommend using the IABs to guide instruction during the year. But I can get back to you on whether the ICAs have been updated over the years. And I believe the blueprint is consistent still. The only change we have made to our blueprint from the first year is the fact that we dropped the performance task in the ELA side. But other than that, our blueprint has remained unchanged. Oh, I see. Okay, I gotcha, Eric. So they aren't actually taking the test, but you're having your teachers analyze it for curricular prioritization. I would, we may want to talk offline on this, because I think it's probably a combination of the blueprint, but also the majority work of the grade, especially in mathematics, that we may want to talk about. So this may be a longer discussion in terms of standards and teaching. So maybe, Eric, we can talk offline on that point, if that's okay. But I'm glad to hear students aren't taking the test. So thank you for that. We'll reach out, follow up. And the new accountability scores will go out, will be public tomorrow, since I know that's on everybody's mind. Will be public tomorrow at the state board meeting. All right, getting back to our growth session here. I hope this explanation on the rough cohort makes sense, and how it relates to the growth model, and how the rough cohort can actually be a useful way to look at that information. And I'm going to go through a little quickly on the growth model. I think everybody understands the growth model by now. We have videos on this. Obviously, we're establishing targets for each student at the student level, and then measuring how students are growing relative to their particular targets. We compute the growth rate, which looks at whether the student met the target, but we also do the APTA as well. And the main threat to inference here, I mean, we've already established the veracity of the scale, but the real main threat here is the exclusion of unmatched students. And I think that's an important point to consider here, or just to keep in mind. I mean, we use the growth model for accountability. It is the cleanest way to look at growth. I think people generally tend to like that. Don't evaluate my school for growth on a student who walked into my school in January of the school year and took the test. So we get that perspective, but I think as a school, as a district, as a program, I think it is important to sort of look at the rough cohort and the matched cohort. Generally, they will move together, but if you have super high mobility, it might be important to look at the rough cohort as well, to sort of look to see how your groups are moving over time, so that you don't exclude students. So I think that's an important consideration to keep in mind. One of the questions that we've received over the years is on our growth targets. We expect that students meet, for the APTA, the expectation is 100%, right? And that's an average measure. But I wanted to sort of take 1 second to sort of speak about why we have the growth measures we do. And I'm not in my slide deck, I'm on EdSight Public, and I went to Smarter Balanced and I clicked on the growth trajectory tool. And so I'm on that growth trajectory tool. And this is not data in the sense that it's not student data, it's just illustrative. If you haven't seen this, I'll just take 1 minute to walk you through it. It's showing an example student who starts in 3rd grade in ELA at 2350. And what happens to that student if they hit 100% of their growth target every year? And in this example, what you see is that this student who starts at high level 1, and our growth model and the 8 achievement categories, who starts at high level 1 and then works their way, achieves 100% of their growth target. What you'll see is that the student reaches just that minimum proficiency, low level 3, in their 3rd year. So 4, 5, 6, they reach that in their 3rd year. And that is if they hit 100% of their growth targets. But we know that statewide, and this is ELA, we're hitting maybe 60% of our growth targets on average. So if I were to change this to 60 and I hit calculate, you'll notice what happens to that student's growth trajectory. What you'll notice is that the student actually never reaches level 3 even after 5 years in grades 3 through 8. Again, students typically don't grow sequentially like this, every year hitting 60% of their growth targets. There's student level variability, is trajectories are different. But this should give you an illustration of why we're not satisfied with 60%. Or even 70%, we really need to see our growth targets in the 90 to 100% range. And that's where we really start to get our students achieving at higher levels. So if we want achievement to change, I mean, growth is the leading indicator of achievement. So that's why we need to see not just growth in 1 year, but we need to see consecutive years of strong growth. And I'm going to digress just 1 second here. When we look at identifying schools of distinction, we obviously use 1 year of data. But when we look at identifying sort of more rigorous methods, rigorous recognition, like blue ribbon schools, and Renee and I work closely together on those blue ribbon schools, we look for multiple years, especially multiple consistent years of high growth, because that's when achievement trajectories change and gaps close. So in case you're wondering how we, or one of the things we look for is consecutive years of high growth. So hopefully that helps to illustrate our growth model. So getting back to the slide deck, I think everybody should know this as well. When we go into EdSight Secure and look at the growth report, when you open up the growth report, you will get the basic information about a particular district. And in this case, I'm looking at mathematics. On the left-hand side, you get the growth rate and the average percentage of target achieved. But on the right-hand side, you can disaggregate that data and see who is growing. You can disaggregate that by their achievement category in year one. In this case, we're looking at how did low-level 1 students grow? How did high-level 1 students grow? And so on. And the pattern you see here is that lower-level students seem to have slightly higher growth than higher-level students, with the exception of the highest category. Because at the highest category, our growth expectation is that students will stay at that level in the next grade. So in that case, the students who are the super high achieving seem to be able to stay at that level at a greater rate than almost any other category here. And yes, Daniel, I think, if we really want high growth, yeah, I mean, I think 90 and above, I mean, even though, I mean, if you look at our schools of distinction now, because it's a normative category, we identify the top 10% of schools, and our cutoffs for schools of distinction are not at 90%. We identify schools of distinction even with 80% and even high 70s sometimes, because that's where our actual reality is. But if we want to actually move the needle consistently for all students, then we really need to see that growth be 90 and above consistently year over year. I know it's easier said than done, but yes, that would be truly what's high growth. Another way that you can look at growth in the EdSight Secure Growth Report is by looking at change in the achievement category. So what this report, we blocked out the student counts here. What this report shows you, and this is in the EdSight Secure Growth Report, you can look at the number of students who started in each of these achievement categories in year one and which achievement categories they were in year two. So you can see in this case that for this particular example, there were, again, you don't actually see the counts, but you can actually see how many students were in level one in low level one in year one, and how many of them remained in low level one in year two. How many moved to high level one in year two? How many moved to low level two in year three, and so on. So you can kind of see how students progressed across the levels. And you can actually double click on each of those buckets in EdSight Secure and pull up a list of your own students. And so, for example, if you're looking at the low level one and you see a bunch of students who have now moved up to high level two, and you can actually double click on those students and see who are those kids who have made significant growth in this past year. So it really helps you see who are the students who are still in this lowest level, in the level that they started in, or also possibly who are students who might have regressed, because this report will also give you that information. So it's based on the matched student data, but it gives you another way of looking at that growth. There is another tab in EdSight Secure in the growth report that gives you the ability to look at comparing groups of students. And in this case, you can look at, on the secure side, you can look at the schools or groups within your own district. On the public side, you can look at all schools statewide. And you can actually see a 4-quadrant perspective. On the horizontal axis, you see achievement, which is the performance index. And on the vertical axis, you can see the percentage of target achieved, which is our growth measure. So you can see on the low left quadrant would be the low achievement, low growth situations. In the upper left quadrant would be the low achievement, high growth situations, whether it be schools or student groups or whatever. On the top right would be high achievement and high growth, and on the bottom bottom right would be the high achievement, low growth. And so, on the left-hand side, you get to see in EdSight Secure within your own district or school. And on the right-hand side, you can actually view this for all schools statewide. And I can flip over to EdSight Secure EdSight Public and show you that report. And it gives you, and I'll pick grade 4, in this case, just for ELA. And you can actually look at who are these schools who are high achievement but high growth, or low achievement but have high growth on this side. So you can hover over those individual buckets and see who those individual schools are as well. So in this case, it just tries to give you a different way of looking at the growth data as it pertains to achievement, sort of contrasting achievement and growth. And just another way to say who's growing, which groups are growing. There is another view within EdSight Secure which gives you a scatter plot. Now, this is a student level view. So in this case, what we do is and again, I can't show you this because this is on the secure side, because it's student level information. You can actually look, what this gives you is the ability to see the performance index for the students and their individual percentage of target achieved. And each dot here represents an individual student. So you can actually look to see at the student level, there are students here on the top left who are low achievement, high growth, and correspondingly low achievement, low growth, and so on. So you can actually hover over each dot and it'll actually show you the name of the student. So you can disaggregate this report by student group and then hover over those individual pieces to see who's actually growing and who's not growing. And lastly, there's the student level data tab as well, which again, I can't show you the actual EdSight Secure report, but this is a screenshot of some of that data that gives you the ability to see, the vertical scale score from year 1, the vertical scale score from year 2, what was the growth target, and then how much of the target was actually achieved. Because you can subtract and then divide that by the target. So you can actually see what percentage of growth target was actually achieved for each individual student. This is a great tool to understand how the growth model actually works. And yes, the recording and slides will be available. Mary will make that available as well. So thank you for that question. So I will close with a new report, and some of you may already be doing this in your own districts. There is, and this is not an EdSight Secure or public, this is available within the reporting system through Cambium, the centralized reporting system, which looks at target level data. And I'm going to show you, and I know many of you look at that target level information, and sometimes it's helpful, but sometimes you may have some questions. But I want to sort of present that information here as a way in which you may be able to use some of that information to learn about instructional strengths and challenges. And there is a new report that's going to be coming out, so I'm presenting this partly to illustrate that point. All right, so what does the target report present to you? It does not present absolute performance. It presents relative performance, and it presents relative strengths and weaknesses. And there are two ways in which it does that. It presents relative strengths relative to proficiency and relative to overall performance. And you also know that in that target report, it doesn't relate to individual students, it relates to groups of students. And let's actually look at that report. Maybe I'll come back to this slide after. And this is a screen grab of a report that should be available in the centralized reporting system, hopefully by the end of November. And I know the team is working to test this and UAT this and test it out and check it and make sure everything is okay. And what this report shows you for each of those assessment targets, and I'm presuming everybody here knows what those assessment targets are, because that is a prerequisite, I guess, for understanding this, and we can you can look that up individually what those assessment targets are. But each of those targets, it shows you how the group of students is doing relative to the proficient student, whether they're exceeding, the group of students are exceeding their performance relative to proficiency or relative to their own overall performance. So that's the proficient column here, and that the next column, the weak or strong, says relative to their own proficiency. Are they exceeding relative to proficiency or relative to their own performance? So, and here it's giving you that trend information. So it would be important to sort of look at that trend when you're looking at this target performance. And why is it important to look at trend for target performance? And this is really key. You know, I would strongly suggest that you not make major shifts in your instructional decisions based on a single year of target information. You want to look at multiple years of target information to know that your interventions or your decisions around instruction are actually making a difference or having the desired impact. So in this example, you know, if you look at target 14, for example, you see that 3 years in a row, students are, because this is cross-sectional data, right? So it's different groups of students. So 3 years in a row, these students are above proficiency, and it's a relative strength for them in each of those 3 years, different groups of students. So in that case, you can have greater confidence that whatever you're doing instructionally from a curriculum perspective is working for your school or district. The reason I say look at multiple years is because this target information, because in an adaptive test, you're pulling 1 or 2 items, it can be based on a very small subset of items. And it also depends on how many items are available in the pool for that target at the student's achievement. Because if the students in your district tend to be higher achieving overall, then there might be in that particular target, in that grade, you know, a certain number of items from which it's pulling. So the information that it's giving you might be based on a smaller subset of items. So that's something important to keep in mind. So that's why the trend is really key. The other thing to note is that the reporting on above the proficiency standard or below the proficiency standard are when we have definitive information, meaning that we have confidence in that target score that it definitely is above or below proficiency based on the measurement, based on the standard error for that measurement for that group of students. When we don't have that confidence is when we say that it's at or near the proficiency standard. So the at or near is really saying that we're not certain whether it's above or below, because based on the error band, we cannot tell. So if everything is at or near, then it's really indefinite information. So I would be very cautious about using the at or near as an inference that they are near the target, because at or near really just means that we don't have definitive information. So it's above the proficiency standard and below the proficiency standard are cases when we have definitive information. So use that, and especially when you have multiple years of trend, then you have certainty in that information. Please don't make big shifts in your instruction based on just 1 year of this target information. So to summarize, you know, cross-sectional data is a snapshot. looking at trends of cross-sectional data has its limitations. Smarter balanced vertical scale is a solid measure that can be used for proficiency and growth. The rough cohort is a good way to look at trends of 2 student groups over time, or 2 different graduating classes over time. When you look at matched cohort results, there are many ways to look at those results. You can look at our growth model. You can look at change in achievement category. You can compare groups of students on 2 dimensions, performance and growth. You can compare individual students on performance and growth. You can also look at the student level data. And lastly, when looking at cross-sectional trend, this target report, try to look for consistency. And if possible, triangulate it with other information. If you're using the interim blocks, I hope you are, to support your instruction, that you can sort of bring that information in as well to sort of bolster your information from the summative. So I appreciate the questions you've given. I know we're at time. Renee, I know I've gone on here for almost an hour. Did you have any other comments to add? I know you would have jumped in at other points if you did, but did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, but you do have one outstanding question in the chat from Jason.
Is that the, I see, okay. The question about growth targets for the alternate assessments, we have looked at it, Jason, and I forget why we didn't feel like we could move forward with that information. I will have to dig back to see what our rationale was, but it didn't seem like we could move forward with a model that would work for public reporting particularly, but perhaps there's something we can provide on a secure level that perhaps you can look at in your own settings. That would be a good perhaps a good way to do it, but definitely I don't think we felt like we had the confidence to do it in a formal accountability public reporting sense. And I forget why. It might have been due to the number of students that end up actually coming into each of those buckets when you start to disaggregate down to school and district level. All right, I will pause for another minute or two if anybody has any questions. If not, I hope this was helpful to you. We will post a recording of this, and thank you for jumping on. Appreciate your time.